We're sitting down with Lionel Chocron, the Chief Product Officer of Hedera Hashgraph. Thank you for sitting down with us today, Lionel.
Thank you for inviting me.
Great. So I'm curious a little bit about your background, where you're from, and your professional background as well.
So, as my perfect English accent shows, I'm from Europe. I'm from France. Came to the US on the West Coast about 20 years ago. Worked in the management consulting space until I joined Cisco first and Oracle second. Had about 10 years at Cisco, focusing on emerging technology and corporate strategy. Emerging technology specifically in the Internet of Things space, was co-started and ran the Internet of Things business unit at Cisco for years until I joined Oracle, where I was leading the emerging technology industry solution group, which was focusing on emerging technology, of course, Internet of Things, blockchain, and AI. And that's when, about 4 to 5 years ago, I got pretty involved into the blockchain space and the adoption of blockchain by Oracle customers at that time. About 9 months ago, got to cross path with the co-founders of Hedera Hashgraph, Mans and Lehman, and got very excited about understanding the technology itself and the potential of that technology to become what the market calls the third generation distributed ledger technology, and could see easily how this third generation, especially Hedera Hashgraph, could become a very nice extension of the work I was starting at Oracle, and how I can see over time large companies adopting a public ledger that has the characteristics of a third generation technology, which Hedera Hashgraph has. So got an opportunity to join the group, and I've been part of the company for about 9 months now.
It's fascinating. I'm curious, were you familiar with blockchain technology or Bitcoin before you started exploring it 4 or 5 years ago at all?
I knew of it like anybody but Bitcoin. I'm not an early crypto enthusiast. I mean, I know people in our company who've been in that space, being part of it, I would say, in the community, 6, 7, 8 years ago. I started to be versed into the blockchain and especially the private ledger space, like Hyperledger and so forth, about 3 to 5 years ago, and starting to build the portfolio of cloud offering that Oracle has today to enable the adoption of private ledger technology by large corporations. So the cloud-based offering of Oracle around blockchain was, part of what I was, involved back at Oracle. Yeah.
What were some of the challenges you faced or lessons you learned while you were trying to bring blockchain products and services, or developing blockchain products and services at Oracle?
So interestingly, since I've been, for the past now, it's starting to date now, 15 years in emerging technology, both at Cisco and Oracle. Interestingly, I've seen the adoption of blockchain going faster than I've seen on IoT and AI. On IoT, for a good reason, is that it's an amazing disruptive technology, but it takes a long time because you are installing devices. It has a major capital investment component to it. If you are connecting the grid, you have to connect millions of devices. So the time it takes to really get the value on the IoT side is pretty long. On the AI, you don't have any hardware to install, but the volume of data that you have to be able to analyze to raise the level of insight that your AI machine is going to give you, minimize what the market calls the false positive, is huge. You cannot do it in a few weeks. It takes years and years and volume of data to be able to train your algorithm. So again, adoption is great, but it is a game for those who have access to the data to be able to optimize. And then blockchain is neither relying on major hardware investment nor relying on major volume of data. blockchain is pretty well understood as a distributed ledger. Everybody knows what a ledger is. And so when you start understanding why would I care about having a distributed ledger, and you start paving the path of how you can use an ecosystem of companies that are working together and sharing information on a ledger, whether it's a private and public ledger, then people tend to click pretty quickly and see the value out of it. So adoption has been actually interestingly quicker in the early days than I've seen on AI and IoT, which I think the tail is pretty long to get there. The challenges, could be a couple of fold. The first one is regulatory. I mean, the regulatory environment for blockchain is still not fully defined, and not just in the US, globally. So while companies have been looking at private ledger, but they see value in extending to a public ledger, they are also trying to understand, the context, the regulatory environment for them to be able to move in that direction. So that's one thing. The second is, I think the change that I've seen that I was seeing at Oracle in adopting a public ledger was based on a few things, performance, stability, security, and governance. And when I was looking at the first generation and second generation players, as amazing as they've done, and they are doing today, by the way, in paving a path for a new industry, there were a lot of shortcomings in terms of, again, performance, stability, security, and governance that my customers, the big companies, were seeing as a no-no. And I think the third generation that's coming today is going to address that.
Are there any characteristics of distributed ledger that you think lend it to being adopted quicker than some of the other emerging technologies you have experience with?
The main piece is, as I said, it's a very low risk way to prove a use case, because at the end of the day, you can isolate a set of workloads and processes on the use case and decide to fork that information on a private or public ledger. And thanks to the companies like the Oracle and IBM and Microsoft of the world who have now enabled cloud-based blockchain platforms, it is pretty easy to enable a proof of concept, that you can sort of trigger in a few weeks now. So I think the ease of adoption through the cloud providers and the key ones, Amazon, Google, Microsoft and others, is making it much easier for people to access and test the technology. And that is, again, different from IoT, where you need, to make a hardware decision, or AI, where you need to get access to, volume of data that very few companies have access to. And until you get one of these two, you're pretty much in a waiting mode. While blockchain, I can enable a use case on the supply chain pretty quickly and prove the value. Now, from proving the value to scaling, there's a definite discussion, but at least you can demonstrate the value pretty quickly.
How did your experience at large corporations such as Oracle prepare you to enter into the distributed ledger space with a company like Hedera Hashgraph?
So I'm clearly coming with a skill set which is focused on enabling the small, medium, and large companies to adopt the distributed technology, distributed ledger technology. And that skill set is, how do you basically easily integrate into the tools and the environment that these companies are using today. When you're big companies, you don't make a decision on DLT. You make a decision on supply chain. You make a decision on identity management. You make a decision on settlement, payment, or whatever it is. That's the use case you care about. And you may have already picked a cloud platform to enable that. You may have decided that the IBM platform is the platform of choice for you, and you have the IBM blockchain platform as the reference for you to enable your use case. If we, and the other players in the market want to enable the mass of the companies to adopt distributed ledger technology, we need to find a way to integrate ourselves into this ecosystem. They may decide to integrate directly at the Hedera layer, for example, for proof of concept, which is totally fine, but moving forward, they will only care about scaling the adoption of a use case if they can, naturally and without much more integration, enable the use case through the existing tools that they are using on a day-to-day basis. And that's probably that mindset that I bring to the table, is the understanding of how enterprises consume technology and scale technology by bringing the adoption of an Hedera value proposition fully integrated into what they're already doing today. For example, they're already running use cases on private ledger like Hyperledger. So how do we basically make Hedera one of the legs of Hyperledger that companies can choose when they want to enable more trust on the transaction basis?
What are some challenges you face coming from Oracle to Hedera Hashgraph, and how are you overcoming them?
The main challenges, to be fair, that I faced, not being a crypto enthusiast from years ago, is one was understanding the regulatory environment. The regulatory environment is pretty complex and not fully defined, and understanding how the decision that you can make to enable utility network in the blockchain space are not easy to understand, and still today there's enough room for interpretation that it's pretty critical for companies like we've done it to carefully look at the different paths in front of us to make sure that we stay in phase with what we believe the regulatory environment is going to be. That's one thing. The second is, contrary to other startup environment, when you are joining a DLT player, you have to deal with all the token on-ramp or token ecosystem. So the exchanges, the wallet, the custody wallet. So this environment, which is not critical if you want to build a traditional startup, I would say, but if you join it in the blockchain space, this ecosystem, which is just maturing as we speak, is actually a pretty big challenge clearly for me, not having had the experience, but I can tell you for everybody in the industry, this is like a learning curve, and that the industry is going through today. So these two components are pretty new. The rest is, for me, seems to be pretty traditional. I mean, this is building a use cases, proving the value, developing a technology, deploying on a POC and so forth. But the regulatory and the token ecosystem are new components that I didn't face before.
I haven't really heard the future of tokenization articulated in an extremely compelling way by anyone, quite frankly. I think everybody's still trying to wrap their heads around the implications of that. You mentioned Hyperledger. Is there a open source component at Hedera Hashgraph to development?
So in the coming year, actually in the coming first half of next year, we are going to deliver what we call our open review milestone, which will be a time when different elements of our platform, services and app, will be open source, and the core platform itself will be open review. So that will be the time when I would say the major milestone for us to achieve this open source and open review commitment will be achieved. Having said that, we already have a lot of elements that are open source today, whether they are on the wallet side, on the developer tools, or on the what we call the mirror node and so forth. All these are already open sourced, and we are committed to this open sourcing environment, because we believe that's the way the community is going to be able to embrace it.
Was there a lot of open source work at Oracle or any of the previous companies you worked?
Oracle has a lot. I mean, especially on the Java side. As you can imagine, Java is driven and owned by Oracle. But as we know, Java and the community of Java APIs and updates and everything is open source today. I mean, I can use Java and integrate that into my application building. So yes, there's a major component of Oracle that is open source, and I think it's just going to continue to increase. I mean, look at Microsoft, which maybe 10 years ago was probably viewed as a non-open source player in the market, and faced harsh critiques because of that. And now you look at where Microsoft is. They've open sourced a lot of their new innovation, and have embraced this evolution. So yes, the big companies, especially today, have really engaged and embraced the open source movement for now the past 5 to 10 years. And this is just reaffirming, what you see in the blockchain space. A lot of that is going to be open source.
Does that affect your job at all as a chief product officer, working on a product that's open source when compared to closed source?
It does in some way. As you are releasing your technology, you need to follow specific open source frameworks so that the community gets to embrace it even faster. So we have to raise the bar in terms of both documentation and access to the repo and everything in a way that is going to check the expectation of the market. But beyond that, it's a different way of engaging the community. Our developers are heavily engaged in participating, reviewing, contributing to code, and this is actually a very nice way when you're a small company to get a bigger community to actually contribute to the evolution of the technology. So that's we see that as very positive. Again, the bottom layer, which is the platform itself, won't be fully open source. It will be what we call open review, but everything else will be open source. So yeah, it's actually no difference from what I've done in the past, actually.
Well, what's next for you, and what's next for Hedera Hashgraph?
So for the company, more than for me, so we've had the opportunity to be open access now for the past 8 weeks, and we've seen adoption both in terms of number of applications, roughly 30, 35 already on the network live, to number of transactions running on the network, reaching 10, 12, sometimes 15 transactions per second, which from zero like 8 weeks ago to where we are today, at the peak level, it's a very exciting time. So now our next phase of work that we have to do to get to what we call the V1. So what we released is a beta version, but we are really focusing on enabling more user experience with developer tools. We are developing a new service which we call the consensus service, which is something we announced in June timeframe, which will allow us to extend a private ledger and get the privacy of a private ledger by extending with the trust of a public ledger. And that work is in progress as we speak, and we are building native integration into Hyperledger to be able to enable private ledger use cases and moving some of these components on a public ledger. So that's a major milestone we want to achieve. And then we need to complete development of a few features, like one that we call state proof. So that's the ability to give a state proof component to any transaction on the network, so that if there's at any point in the future a contention between you and I, let's say we do a transaction and you want to be able to prove in a legal court, if you wanted to, that transaction effectively happened at that time in that order, we are going to be able to enable the state proof level component features on our network, which will meet the needs of many use cases, especially in regulatory environments where they need to get some of this information publicly verifiable and publicly auditable. So there are a few key milestones we need to achieve between now and mid next year, and that's going to keep us focused and working with the council members on our side.
You mentioned that's great. So is there anything else that we should keep an eye out for at Hedera Hashgraph?
So one element that I don't know if your audience understands that, but one element of our model is what we call our governance council. The governance council will be a group of 39 global organizations, many of them private companies, could be academics and so forth, that are literally governing the network. So they are running nodes and they are governing the roadmap and they are managing the treasury. Today we already have 9 major companies who joined us and are running nodes, some of them being in the technology space like IBM, others in the telecommunication space like Dutch Telecom, Swisscom, and Tata Communication, others in the legal environment like DLA Piper, which is one of the largest law firms in the world. The point I'm making is we believe that having a trusted group of global companies whose brand are well known to govern and drive the evolution of this network and contribute by running nodes on the network will raise the level of trust for companies who want to look into a public blockchain space and think about which one seems to be governed by peer companies. Then we believe this is a direction that the market will reward over time and is already rewarding as we speak. So one of the things to watch out for is the evolution of our governance council and the next set of 29 companies that we are going to announce over the next 2 years.
Great. So as we kind of conclude things here, you mentioned earlier that you're from France, correct?
Correct, yes.
And are you living currently in the United States?
Yeah, I live on the West Coast in San Francisco. Yeah.
How long have you lived here?
20 years.
And that transition was made for professional reasons?
It was made for, yes, professional reasons. Effectively, in that case, I got to do a graduate degree, a master degree on the West Coast at UC Berkeley, and back in 1998, and got an opportunity to come and spend 2 years in an amazing, university environment, and I got to be falling in love with the Bay Area. So, from one thing to another, here I am, 20 years later, still in the Bay Area, but loving it. Yeah.
Was that the plan to stay here long term for such a long time?
No, it's never, at least for me, it was not the plan. You spend 2 years and you say, what about, doing a couple of years of, professional experience in addition to what I had done, back in Europe, and you do 2 years and then do another third year, and then, from one thing to another, got to join Cisco, and first kid, second kid, third kid, you fast forward and time is passing, and, the environment is great, the country, the opportunities in the Bay Area are amazing, and the, I would say the diversity of people in the Bay Area is very reflective of what I wanted to see. So I think I found my home, and who knows, maybe in 20 years I'll be here, but it's a very exciting time. Yeah.
Well, great. Lionel Chocron, thank you so much for sitting down with us today. The Chief Product Officer of Hedera Hashgraph, and we're at the Blockchain Expo North America World Series. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time.